Hello, welcome back to Historical Biography, and today we're going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson, who I have here listed as the problematic founding father. They're all kind of problematic, but Thomas Jefferson definitely has some issues, and we're going to get to those in the video. So don't worry, we will talk about all aspects of Thomas Jefferson. It's not going to be just bright and cheery over here in Historical Biography today. So let's get started learning about Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers here in the United States. So who was Thomas Jefferson? Well, he was an American statesman, a diplomat, a lawyer, an architect, a philosopher, and a founding father. So he did a lot of things in his lifetime. One of those classic early American Renaissance men who kind of dabbled in everything. He was originally from Virginia, and Jefferson was the United States' second vice president and the third president. So he was a large part of our early leadership in the United States history. He also wrote the Declaration of Independence, believing that all, at least white people, which we're going to talk about a little bit, have certain unalienable rights. Whether or not other people have those rights is, we don't really know. There are times where he says that he believes that, but his actions speak differently. So we'll talk about that too. So his early life, Jefferson was born in 1743 at his family's plantation. He inherited 5,000 acres of land, including Monticello, which is where he would end up living, and that's now a museum. It's a really beautiful house, really cool place to go check out. If you're ever in Virginia, to go check out Monticello. And he got that all when he turned 21. As most people do, they get their inheritance around that time. He was educated first by his father and his father's friends, and then entered the College of William and Mary at 16, so relatively early. I guess back then, though, kids went to school a little bit earlier, where he studied mathematics, metaphysics, and philosophy. He learned of John Locke and British empiricists during his time there, and that kind of greatly influenced his thinking of what he thought about the world and the philosophy of how things should work. After that, he was admitted to the Virginia bar. He became a lawyer in 1767. He also represented Albemarle County in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the kind of like a legislature, but it was basically just like wealthy people from different areas of Virginia got together and talked about business. So he was in that pretty young in his life, and he took 7 different cases for freedom-seeking slaves during his time as a lawyer, and he advocated for their freedom, invoking natural laws. However, his clients were never freed. So this is some evidence here that says that Jefferson was kind of anti-slavery, but then again, we're going to get to this, but he owned many people in his lifetime, and did some other pretty nasty things as well. So, there's the idea that he at least thought that these people deserved rights, but then once again, his actions speak louder than his words in his case. Afterwards, he began the construction of Monticello, his family home, in 1768, and the house was built by local masons and carpenters with the assistance of Jefferson's slaves, right? He owned people. And then it was later remodeled after his return from Europe. He kind of got inspired by European architecture. He was in England and Paris for a while. And so he was like, gosh, gotta, update the house, make it look more European, I guess. He married his third cousin, as is done sometimes, Martha Wales Skelton, who was already a widow at 23. So this is her second marriage. And Jefferson never remarried after promising his wife he wouldn't on her deathbed. So when she dies, he does not remarry, because he promises her that he won't. Let's talk a little bit about his political career. I know we kind of touched on it, the fact that he was part of that Burgesses house in Virginia, but his American political career happens a little later. First of all, he was one of the primary authors of the Declaration of Independence, and one of the youngest delegates at the convention. He was only 33 when he was doing all of this. He's just slightly older than myself, so look out, folks. I'm on my way. Jefferson used a proposal for the Virginia Constitution, George Mason's draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and his own beliefs in the idea of Locke and Montesquieu to write this declaration. And you all know it, all the different grievances and the talk of inalienable rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's definitely just a quote from Locke. So we've got different things here, right? That we're starting to kind of see where his views are when it comes to how things should be. Afterwards, he becomes a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and he works to create the state's constitution. So he basically worked with a few people to write Virginia's constitution. And then in 1778, he's tasked with reorganizing the state's laws. And over the next 3 years, he would write 126 bills, all of which were passed to help reorganize the law in Virginia. He was elected governor for a 1-year term in 1779 and 1780. And then he moved the state capital to Richmond during his tenure. So he moved it to a different town. It's a little bit closer to his home, and just not in that kind of busy area where the British were mostly. So something to think about. Then as a congressman, he would serve under the Articles of Confederation as one of the delegates from Virginia. He chaired the committee that wrote the Land Ordinance of 1784, and he recommended the first American currency. He did add a provision to ban slavery in the Northwest, but it was cut by Congress, and it was added later. This was back when the South had a very large voting bloc, and they were able to veto stuff like that relatively easily in the Articles of Confederation, mostly because every state had to agree, and so not all those southern states were going to agree with his idea that we should ban slavery in other areas of the United States. However, it did end up getting in later. Afterwards, he was become the minister to France. He was sent by Congress to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris, so he can negotiate treaties with a number of nations. Franklin then resigned as the minister of France because he wanted to head back to Pennsylvania and be a part of that. And so Jefferson took on the role himself after Franklin's resignation. It was while in France that Jefferson began his sexual relationship with his slave, Sally Hemmings. And while in France, Jefferson also witnessed the beginning of the French Revolution and became good friends with Marquis de Lafayette. Let's turn back to the Sally Hemmings bit here. We'll talk about Sally a little bit more, but this is the time when in Europe, away from the prying eyes of other Americans, that he decides to start having a relationship with a slave, someone he owns and someone who really can't say no. So this is essentially, it is a non-consensual relationship. It is rape. So not a great light on Jefferson here. He could have freed her and then started, having a closer relationship with her, but he would not do that. He kept her in a state of servitude, which isn't great. Not a great look for Thomas. Afterwards, after being the minister to France, he returns home, but is chosen by George Washington to become the first Secretary of State. He often clashes with Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who you might know a little bit about from the musical Hamilton. And he clashed with him about national debt, the location of the nation's capital, and a few other things. They were basically political opposites. Hamilton wanted a strong federal government that was going to be able to drive the nation forward, while Jefferson believed that each individual state should have more sway and more rights, which would kind of be like going back under the Articles of Confederation. I don't understand why he wanted to go back to that. Jefferson soon began to split with Washington and would then go on to found the Democratic Republican Party of Monticello with James Madison's help. So he became the first oppositional party in the United States. Or he founded the first oppositional party in the United States. In 1796, Washington was stepping down after 2 terms, which he thought was important to allow the country to move on and continue to accept transitions of power. Jefferson would lose the Electoral College vote to John Adams by 3 votes, and then because of the way the Constitution was written back then, he became the vice president, which didn't really make sense because they didn't like each other very much. So he's now the vice president. This is back when the vice president didn't do much. These days, they don't really do a whole lot either, but they can be given a lot of things to do, potentially, if they have the power. Like under the Trump administration, Mike Pence had a lot of things that he handled on his own. So there's a possibility for the vice president to do a lot of things, but not back then. Back then, the vice president was just kind of there in case they needed a new president. Jefferson was well suited to lead the Senate, however, and he helped formulate the procedures and rules of the body. So the rules and regulations of the Senate that they still use these days were mostly created or Jefferson was a part of that process of creating those rules. Jefferson and Madison lobbied against the Alien and Sedition Acts, which passed during his tenure as vice president. which basically made it so that the government could arrest people who the government didn't see fit or didn't seem to think that they were American enough. That was kind of Adams's way of suppressing dissent, which wasn't great. Not a great look on John Adams. In 1800, then, Jefferson ran against John Adams and Aaron Burr, and Jefferson won the election. Aaron Burr became vice president, and Jefferson won, actually, with help from political rival Alexander Hamilton. He threw his support behind Jefferson instead of his longtime friend Burr, and then Jefferson became president. This, of course, would lead to the duel between Hamilton and Burr, the fact that he would not support him in this election. So as the third president of the United States, Jefferson began to do several things that he had been kind of talking about for years. He began to dismantle the Federalist economic system built by Alexander Hamilton, which he did not like. He shrank the military and navy because he didn't think we needed as big of one because we were at peace. And he founded the West Point Military Academy so he could train military officers. He knew that having a military was important. He just didn't think it should be a large standing army. Jefferson was also a strong contributor to the Library of Congress. So he'd from time to time just like tell him, here, get this stuff and put it in there. So a lot of things that are in the Library of Congress are there because of Thomas Jefferson. During his tenure as president, there was the case Marbury versus Madison. Jefferson, this case established judicial review, which meant that the Supreme Court strengthened itself during this time. And this was because Jefferson was trying to undo federal appointments made by his predecessor. Basically, he was like, hey, I know Adams gave out all these things saying you're going to be this or that or whatever. Well, not anymore. Now I'm putting my people in charge. So this basically said that, one, Jefferson could do that, but then also the Supreme Court gets to interpret the law. So that was a pretty important thing that happened while he was president. Another important thing were the Barbary Wars. They took place near Morocco, and they involved a lot of American naval vessels, which engaged pirates in the Mediterranean. Basically, American ships weren't protected by the British Navy anymore, and so American ships were being raided and sunk by pirates in Tripoli. And so American troops were sent overseas to fight these pirates so that our shipping would be safe. That was what the Barbary Wars were. Later on, in 1803, the French under Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory, which is highlighted in green here, to the United States. And Napoleon sold the territory for $15 million, and that's because he wanted to fund the military things he was doing at home in France. He realized that trying to defend this territory was near impossible with all the other things he was trying to do, and so he's like, I'm just going to sell it to the United States. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory doubled the size of the United States at the time. Jefferson also tried to bully Spain into selling in Florida in 1805, but that didn't work. We did end up acquiring Florida in like 1820, I think, but this time didn't work. He also funded the Lewis and Clark expedition, which started during his tenure, and it was just a way to explore this uncharted territory that he had purchased. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the expedition into the United States Western Territory, and Jefferson personally tutored Lewis on mapping, botany, natural history, and navigation in preparation for the trip. So this is something that he personally ensured was successful. Under Jefferson, American indigenous policies were changed and kind of refined into a more solid political stance. Jefferson believed that indigenous Americans were on equal level to Europeans, unlike many others at the time. So he thought that they had equal standing against the new American country. He implemented an assimilation policy that would allow for peaceful treaties with tribes, encourage agriculture within these tribes so they could kind of change the ways that they were doing things, and then allowing the tribes to make purchases using tribal lands as collateral. So basically they were allowing them to use their tribal land as collateral for loans so they could buy stuff. Several tribal leaders accepted these policies, including Black Hoof of the Creek, but not all leaders agreed to this, obviously. Under Tecumseh, some of the Shawnees opposed these policies, and there were skirmishes and battles with the Shawnees in the West. Historians debate whether or not Jefferson actually had good intentions here. Some believe that this assimilation policy was just like the best course of action to avoid conflict, while others think it's just kind of a pretext to make it so they can take more land from the tribes. Kind of up to you. It does seem a little bit like it's just setting the Native Americans up for failure in that sense. So Hindsight's 2020. We don't actually know if Jefferson really truly believed this was the best path forward, or if this was some sort of underhanded government trick. Also, during Jefferson's second term, Burr's relationship with him rapidly deteriorated after the 1800 election. And during Jefferson's first term, the Constitution was amended, which made it so that presidents were elected by ticket. And so Burr was dropped by Jefferson for 1804 after he shot and killed Hamilton in a duel. Kind of killed his political career there. Burr travels west, and he ends up trying to recruit notable politicians to create a military force to either seize Mexico, Spanish Florida, or create a new country in New Orleans. He was captured in 1807 and put on trial, but he was acquitted of treason. So, you can judge that. I'm pretty sure Burr died really quickly afterwards. There was also some scandals that happened under Jefferson's tenure. For one, General James Wilkinson was appointed as the governor of the Louisiana Territory, but he was also determined that he was on Spain's payroll. They have documents from Spain from that time period that show that they were paying him to help Spain out. Also, British ships, including the HMS Leopard, fired on the USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia, and the British began to raid American ships and take American sailors into the British Navy during that time. They tried to embargo British goods, but that actually hurt the United States more than it helped. And it did keep the peace, but as you know, the War of 1812 happens 5 years later, started over the same issue. So it clearly didn't actually solve the problem. After he was president, like most presidents, he kind of moved on into this kind of special public sphere that presidents kind of take on. The first thing he did was found a university, the University of Virginia, in 1819. This was supposed to be a university accessible to all economic strata based on merit. So it was trying to get it so that anybody could get to college or get educated if they wanted to. He designed all the buildings, purchased the land, and designed the university's curriculum. So clearly, this was a kind of a personal, I wouldn't say vanity project, but it's kind of a vanity project. It's something he funded himself. In his final days, he spent time reconciling with John Adams, who had been his good friend prior to the electoral politics of the United States. And the former presidents would end up writing 158 letters to each other over 14 years. They ended up dying within hours of each other at their respective homes in Massachusetts and Virginia. So let's kind of review Jefferson's views and his controversies, the things that he's best known for. First of all, for society and government, he believes that citizens have unalienable rights. But then again, who are considered citizens? In his world, slaves were not citizens. And he kind of tried to make it so that less people were slaves, but he didn't really try to openly advocate to end slavery. So, sure, citizens have unalienable rights. But once again, who are citizens? He believed government should not infringe on individual rights. So he was definitely kind of like the precursor of the states' right movement. And he believed that the majority should be constantly challenged to ensure freedom and that liberty remained intact, which can be interpreted in a lot of ways. He was also a very big proponent of democracy. It was the best way to express society's will. He supported national determination, cultural uniformity, and the education of all men. Remember, not women, only men. He also believed in the free press and public education, and he fervently supported those things. He thought that there should always be a free press because they can rail against the majority, and also public education because every person deserved to be educated, and that would help the democracy be more successful. Religiously, Jefferson was raised in the Episcopal Church in Virginia. However, he would later be influenced by deists, people that believe that God created the universe and then just let it go, not really interfering with anything, just kind of watching it. He said that being a Christian meant to follow the simple teachings of Jesus. He was very anti-clerical, basically saying that clerics had perverted the faith with jargon and mystery. So he was pro-Christianity, but he was anti-established Christianity. He was anti the church. Jefferson didn't trust government banks, and he actively tried to oppose them. During the Washington administration, he butted heads with Alexander Hamilton about the national debt and the U.S. Bank. He would lose that fight with Hamilton. However, during his presidency, Jefferson tried to curtail that bank's influence, but he did not end up eliminating it. His own Secretary of the Treasury was like, please don't do that. That's a bad idea. Now the more difficult one, slavery. Thomas Jefferson was a part of the slave-owning aristocracy of the South. And the first record of Jefferson's holdings from 1774 says he owns 41 slaves. However, over his lifetime, he would end up owning 600 people. Despite his stated benevolence, historians often disagree, pointing to evidences of abuse, whippings, and injury on his own plantations. So saying that Jefferson was rarely there, and so the people he had running the plantation were still doing these awful things, even though he would say he was against it. And then ultimately, Jefferson argued for the gradual release of slaves, fearing that instantaneous release would cause issues. So he wouldn't want to just free people. He wanted to make sure that there was a way to educate them and get them up to speed beforehand, but he never really laid out a plan for how that would work. Let's talk more specifically about Sally Hemmings, the slave owned by Jefferson, who he had a sexual relationship with. DNA evidence has concluded that Jefferson fathered all of Hemmings' children, so he definitely had a long-standing relationship with this woman, but he never freed her. So like I said earlier, this is definitely an instance of a non-consensual sexual relationship, a rape. Jefferson's relationship with Hemmings was super inappropriate, non-consensual, and it would have been better if he had freed her and her children, but he didn't do that during his lifetime. Despite the DNA evidence that Hemmings is obviously deeply intertwined into Jefferson's life and family, her descendants are not allowed to be buried at Monticello, even though Jefferson's are. Jefferson has been held up as an icon of liberty, democracy, and republicanism, and he promoted science and the learning of men. However, he's been viewed less highly recently due to his ownership of slaves, his non-consensual relationship with Sally Hemmings, and his flip-flopping of policies once he was elected president. So he has a very complicated historical legacy, doing some things that people would find really awesome and a lot of things that people also don't enjoy. So whatever it is your views, it's really up to you. You have to interpret the information and see how you fall when it comes to Thomas Jefferson, like any person has to. That's part of being a historian, is looking at evidence and coming to your own conclusion. So I hope that you can come to your own conclusion after watching this video. Thank you once again so much for watching these historical biographies. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you can know when the next videos are coming. And, comment on this video. If there's something that you really are looking forward to, there's something you want me to cover, let me know so I can make that video and help you learn more. That's my goal. So if you have something in particular you're interested in learning about, drop a comment and I'll see what I can do about it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you later.